KC Laboratory. Sponsored by Emprise Bank.
It's the KC Laboratory, brought to you by Emprise Bank. When was the last time that you personally went into a bank? I can't remember the last time that I did. So now more than ever, who you're doing business with is a lot more important than their proximity to you. Emprise Bank is a trusted business partner that can serve anyone, anywhere, including you. Emprise Bank, member FDIC, is our partner in Possible at KC Sports Network and for the KCSN Draft Guide. We love them. We appreciate them. They make all of this happen. My name is Craig Stout. You are joined live with the KC Laboratory or listening the next day. And I sound a little different than Kent, who's normally here and who is away on work, impressing people with his glorious hair and wonderful charisma. But speaking of glorious hair and wonderful charisma, my good friend Matt Lane at Matty KCSN has joined me today. Matty, how you doing today, buddy?
Well, I'm glad you're carrying on Kent's tradition of messing up the Twitter because you forgot the underscore. So you nailed it. Underscore. You nailed the Kent impression right off the top. I mean, like, if it wasn't for the voice, I'd have thought you guys are the same person. Game on the exact same. No, I'm excited to be here. And per usual, when Craig and I get together before the show starts, we're like, hey, just the two of us. It's going to be a 22-minute show. And undoubtedly, this is going to be 58 minutes full of the nerdiest football talk you guys are probably going to go ahead and hear for the majority of the life of this podcast.
You're setting a high bar here. I'm a little nervous about how this is going because you're setting such a high bar here.
But Matt is right. I can go down.
We're gonna nerd out a little bit here, and one of the things that both Maddie and I like to nerd out about is kind of the thresholds for what Steve Spagnuolo looks for in his pass rushers, the edge position, and in the cornerback position. Those are two positions that the Chiefs are in desperate need of this offseason. I think that some people have heard some of this, as far as the general specifications, but then we're going to talk about the draft cliffs at those positions, players that may fit, players that may not fit, and how that could impact the Chiefs' draft strategy going forward. We've talked a little bit about some of this stuff in the past, but kind of tying it all together for some of these people who maybe don't know the full qualifications, don't understand the ramifications. We get a lot of mock drafts sent to us, and some of them, Maddie can, kind of attest to this. You look at some of those guys and you're like, I don't think that Steve Spagnuolo would like that kind of guy. So maybe we set some of this up, explain why some of this works the way that it does and why Steve Spagnuolo likes some of this stuff. So, Maddie.
Oh, well, I just want to say, I'm not going to lie. Like, the most disappointing part about getting mock drafts or having to do one is putting in the guys that I think the Chiefs will actually take. Or when somebody says, hey, what do you think about this? And they have Nick Bonito, for instance, in there. And like, what do you think about this? Like, hey, I love the player, but I got bad news for you. And like, sometimes I don't respond because I just don't want to be the bearer of bad news, or I don't want to deal with this. Like, people treat it as if sometimes, not everybody, but sometimes as if I'm saying the player's bad or couldn't be good here. No, that's not the case. It's just simply the Chiefs, Steve Spagnuolo, especially as we're talking defense, the Chiefs, they're just not going to use that player. They're not going to be interested in that player. There's a lot of data that backs it up here. So, I think that's what we're about to get into, but I just want to say, like, I am sorry, anybody that I said, hey, like the player, but your mock draft, not great Chiefs fits, but it's just, unfortunately, the Chiefs really do have a type. And I don't particularly like the type, but they have a type at defensive end and at quarterback.
I mean, we talked about this a little bit when we looked at like the offensive tackles last year. Andy Reid had a type at offensive tackle, and it was very focused on arm length. And so we kind of, before the Chiefs traded for Orlando Brown Jr., went through a lot of mock drafts, a lot of scenarios trying to look at the offensive tackle group, and they were largely short-armed. And so we kind of kept coming back to, I don't know if the Chiefs are going to be comfortable with some of these options. Sure enough, they weren't. They trade for Orlando Brown Jr. So we're kind of going to look at some of the similar things. Let's start with edge, Maddie. You write something for the KCSN Draft Guide every single year, evaluating edge prospects and Spagnuolo fits. Why don't you run the people down on generically what that is? We don't have to go into all the data, but generically what that is.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna say, if you guys want the full visual of this on the KCSN Substack, that's kcsn.substack.com. I actually put this article up there for everybody that's a member to read it before the draft guide is coming out on Wednesday. So this upcoming Wednesday, the draft guide is coming out to you guys. Like, it's right around the corner. There's a link here in this description if you haven't gotten yours yet, but make sure you get on top of that because it's worth it. But if you need a preview, head on over to the Substack. You got to check out this article. It'll have kind of the in-print version of what I'm about to try to say here. But essentially, Steve Spagnuolo, going all the way back to his first stint as defensive coordinator with the New York Giants, has a very specific type of defensive end. And that type is big, so over 6'3", long, over 33-inch arm length, and, well, strong didn't really play a part in it, but, weight, big again. We're back to big. It's big twice. You got to be tall, long, and big. So over 6'3", over 33-inch arms, over 260 pounds. You fit all three of those criteria, you're A-okay. You're perfectly in the Steve Spagnuolo kind of wheelhouse of the guys he likes. And in fact, over all this time, he has played, 31 defensive ends have played significant snaps for him while he's been a defensive end or a defensive coordinator or head coach in the NFL. So 31 guys, only seven guys have missed one of those numbers. Only 7 have missed one of those thresholds of defensive ends. So, that paints a pretty clear picture, at least I think, of what he's looking for.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I like that you kind of put in there that explosiveness and agility, there's no real through line there. Steve
Zero
Spagnuolo
correlation.
Does not. Obviously he's fine with guys that have that, but it's not a requirement like it is for, some of these other defensive coordinators that want bendier pass rushers, explosive guys. Steve Spagnuolo wants size, length, and size again, basically playing with power. And so we've looked at that. He's been doing that for the past several years. And so far, I believe Mike Dana is the real outlier of all of these guys, a day 3 pick, but, a very high IQ player, plays bigger than Mike Dana is, because he's very smart with his hand technique and things like that. But by and large, these bigger guys. So we've looked at some of these guys in the draft so far this year, Maddie, and we kind of have talked about this. First round has a few of those. Let's run through kind of the early guys there. Aiden Hutchinson. He is a make or a miss for Steve Spagnuolo here.
Well, so I want to drive this point home because you said it, and I think it is really worth talking about real quick. Up until 2020, so from 2007 up until the 2020 draft, not a single player was too short, too light, and had arm length. No two player had 2 of those. No 2 player was too short and too light, or too short and didn't have long enough arms. They had to only miss one criteria. Mike Dana was drafted in 2020 and missed all 3. All 3. First guy out of his entire career that missed more than one, and he missed all 3. The Chiefs followed that up in 2021 with Melvin Ingram, who also was too short and has shorter arms. So you can maybe argue that the Chiefs and Steve Spagnuolo are trending towards breaking the trend. If you look at the percentages, he's actually more consistent with the thresholds in Kansas City than out of. But the guys that miss are just a little bit more wild. So you can hang your hat on that if you love some guys that we get to that I say are, not as much of a fit. However, Aiden Hutchinson, kind of surprising, I think, to some. He's only I put him as a medium high fit because that means he just misses one of the primary criteria. His arm length, 32 inches, too short. So he's the right height, the right weight. He just missed the arm length. I'm a rapid fire these real quick. So I don't think we can do a whole lot on them.
Let's get through the early dudes. Yeah.
Kayvon Thibodeau, also a medium high fit. He's too light, only 254 pounds at the combine. You would think weight is easy to just add on, and it probably is. But guess what? It hasn't affected Steve Spagnuolo in the past. Being light has been the hardest no-no. That is the one area he does not wiggle on as lighter guys. So that's concerning for someone like Jermaine Johnson, who I think if you look at him and see that he's this guy that looks like a perfect fit for Steve Spagnuolo, he came into the combine at 254. He was 259 at the Senior Bowl when he was down there. So, the weight fluctuates, but he's a little light as well. So again, we're looking at a high medium fit. The only high fit, Travon Walker, fits all the criteria, over 6'3", over 260 pounds, has over 33-inch arms. Like that's of your top 4. He's the only guy that's a perfect fit, but none of them you can rule out. I think that's the key here. You can't rule out any of them because he's more than willing to dip into the pool of, oh, hey, your arms are a little short. Fine. You're a little too short. Fine. It's just when you start stacking multiple misses of the criteria together where it becomes a problem.
Yeah. And so Trevon Walker of those top 4 guys is the one that would fulfill all of those. Would be an ideal fit in Kansas City. My goodness, like he's got the explosion. He's got a little bit of the bit. Like I would love Trevon Walker in Kansas City. Trevon Walker may not make it out of the first 2 picks of the NFL draft. He really might not. I mean, there's so much hype around him right now. Of these 4, realistically, the guys that we're seeing, maybe there's not as much of a consensus on is Kayvon Thibodeau and Jermaine Johnson. And those 2 guys, like you said, both weigh the same. So if you're in on one, you're probably in on both. Kayvon Thibodeau has had a week, showed up, tested fine. Like if you look at his relative athletic score, it was a 9.6 out of 10. I believe, Math Bomb put out there that he was 57th, in the history of the NFL, but it was the combined numbers. It wasn't anything that was like super elite about what he did. And I think that, Maddie, we were talking about this a little bit about how you expected maybe a guy with that sort of hype, with that sort of profile to have an elite trait to kind of hang your hat on. And instead, everything was very good, but nothing was quite, at the very tip top peak that would make you really excited about him.
Yeah, that's the tricky part with Kayvon Thibodeau here is I'd say his 40 time was elite for his size. He's a 254 pounder and what he ended up running like a 4.5 something. It was in the low 4.5s or mid 4 or here it is 4.58 with a 1.59 10-yard split. Like that's pretty good. So that is good. That is elite. The problem is when you combine that with 119-inch broad jump, which is again good, but not elite. And then especially the 7.233 count. That's where you kind of lose it. So you look at the prototype, you have this really fast rusher, 254 pounds, super fast. Okay, maybe he's really explosive off the line. And you watch his tape, it says he's explosive, but 119-inch broad jump, that's good. That's not great. You're not going to constantly be putting offensive tackles on their heels afraid of that. And now the 10-yard split's good, so maybe it's a skill translation thing. But then you look at the 3 cone, I think most people already saw him as a little bit stiff. 7.32 is really stiff for a guy at his weight. Guys that light got to bend. And if you can't bend, like he's fast, he's linear. Who's the last fast linear player that we remember coming through Kansas City, Craig?
Oh, well, let's see. I can't think of one right now.
I was thinking D Ford. That D Ford.
You were going to go D? Okay.
I was going D.
I thought D was a little bit bendy, just a smidge,
a little
bendy.
bit. But he was a little linear and fast. And it's like I just think that's the kind of athletic profile that you're kind of looking at. And so I think that is the hesitation that I have with Thibodeau. I think NFL teams might have a little bit of that. Just they see a stiffer guy that's a little bit lighter, and their issues more off the field, I think. But that's the holdup I see with the athletic profile.
Yeah, I mean, Thibodeau carries himself like a guy that thinks he's the best player in the NFL already. He does. And there's something to be said about that confidence. Personally, I don't have a problem with that confidence if he shows up and he's willing to work, which that's on the scouts and the coaching staff to figure out. I don't care how confident he is. Let's go, But those 4 guys are probably going very high in the draft. And trying to climb up to get one of those guys is going to be difficult. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago. You're having to spend basically both your first-round picks or a first 50 and the Ryan Poles comp pick to maybe get up to like the early teens, something like that. It's a lot of assets to give up for a defensive end. I personally would do it so that you have a pass rusher, a young pass rusher, but that's kind of where the initial cliff drops. Is that right, Maddie? Am I correct in saying that? I know that some people have some other guys around there, but I think that that's where the real cliff starts.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very clear and evident cliff. I think having David Ojabo before he ruptured his Achilles, you could maybe make this argument that he was either in that group or he was at least providing a bridge to the next group. But without him or with him being injured, I think it's a pretty significant or pretty substantial drop. After these 4, do you have a day one guy that's ready to come in and compete at a high level? Do you have a guy that not only is ready to come in and compete at a high level on day one, but also comes with a real ceiling? Like, I think you could make an argument that there's some guys we'll get into that have, the ability to play on day one. There's guys that you'll make that argument, but how good will they be? You're trading off the ceiling for the instant impact. These 4 guys are, I think, instant impact with high-end starter ceiling. And after this, I think you take a big step backwards.
Absolutely. Ojabo, by the way, 250 pounds, misses the Steve Spagnuolo criteria there. Then you kind of take another step back. Boye Mafe, George Karlaftis, both have 32 3/4 inch arms. Once again, taking a step back there. You're really talking about, you're having to go pretty deep after that to get another guy that you feel comfortable with. Arnold Ebiketie also misses height and weight. Majai Sanders misses weight and arms. Nick Benito, like you mentioned, misses weight and arms. Josh Paschal misses height and arms. These are all guys that we've talked about, kind of flirted with a little bit as being, round 1 pick or a round 2 guy. And so these guys are all missing multiple criteria. Some of these guys are missing 2 criteria, which, again, like Maddie said, are right out. So this is a situation where you're probably not drafting those guys. Once again, that cliff, that fall off at that point, because I know we actually have a comment in the chat here from Nate Dogg. Who's in charge though, Spags or Veach? At one point, doesn't Veach have to put his foot down and take the best player? Measurements be damned. You would think so, but that's not been the case. It really hasn't been the case. Like, they have largely adhered to these strict guidelines. And if you are spending draft capital, if you are drafting a player early and it does not fit what the defensive coordinator prefers for a player like that, that player may not play as much. He may not, have the same sort of impact as you would expect within the system. Like, these are all things that you have to think about when allocating these draft assets. Maddie and I would love to have some of these guys, but because Steve Spagnuolo has these rigid thresholds, and it's gotten him to multiple Super Bowls, won him a couple with a defensive line play. He's going to continue to probably adhere to a lot of this stuff, which is why we're looking at this and going, oh man, well, this stinks. But Maddie, who else do we have kind of flirting around here that you could be looking at with some of these early picks that the Chiefs have?
Yeah, let's take a look at that second group. We talked about that first cliff kind of falling off after the top 4. So, we're thinking top 10, top 15 picks tops. You're probably losing those top 4, right? Yeah. So let's go look at the next group. I'm going to name off some guys, and you can tell me if you think somebody else should be here. But David Ojabo, we talked about him. Mm-hmm. George Karlaftis, we did a little bit of a film room on him in the KCSN Discord last week. It's still out there. If you guys pop over in the Discord and the film room channel, you can find that. Boye Mafe, Arnold Ebiketie, Josh Paschal, I'll put in here. And then I'm going to round it out with Drake Jackson from USC. So that's the next tier to me. And I'm looking at these guys, and I see guys that a lot of them aren't going to fit Steve Spagnuolo's criteria. Boye Mafe, actually, his hands or his arm length at the Senior Bowl, he'd be a perfect fit. At the Combine, they came in a little shorter. He's clearly a player that I think the Chiefs would be interested in based on the physical profile. George Karlaftis, arms are a little short, but the rest of it fits a lot of what the Chiefs like to do in terms of their defensive end. Drake Jackson, a little short. He's like a half inch or 3/8 of an inch under the 6'3" threshold. Again, these are all guys I wouldn't be surprised to see the Chiefs be interested in. They're all part of that second tier, but what does that second tier mean? Like, when you hear those names, what do you think those guys are going to do in year 1?
That's the thing. In year 1, those guys are probably rotational players at best. You're not putting them opposite of Frank Clark and saying, okay, go out and set an edge and, rack up, a whole bunch of pressures and a whole bunch of sacks. Like, that group of guys needs some seasoning. They need some work to get to the level that you would expect, with the exception of maybe Karlaftis. That's a group that you're going to need to put through the paces, work through the film room, have them be able to ID plays at a high level, and then you're gambling on ceiling. Now, that being said, the Chiefs need a guy. Now, again, we've talked about this before. Melvin Ingram is waiting in the wings, just waiting until training camp to show up. A guy in that group makes a lot of sense. But the expectation as it is right now, I see from a lot of fans, is like, oh, just go get one of those guys and he's your starter, opposite of Frank Clark. I don't think that's the case. It's rough for some of those guys to come in and contribute. Some of these guys have been little better athletes over the past couple of years, maybe a little better players, guys that we were a little more fond of that we thought could come in and contribute a little more immediately. And a lot of those guys end up as rotational players too. So I think that that's where the large part of that group is too.
Yeah, and that's why I think the cliff aspect is so important here, because you're looking at, we just named what we had 4 guys off the top, and then we just looked at like another, what is it, 6 guys with 10 edges. That's a pretty good group. That's a pretty good group to be looking at for the first 2 rounds, right? But there's the Chiefs have no real chance to get one of the first 4, so they're going to be vying for one of those next 6 names that have been mentioned, assuming they don't trade up. Only a couple of them fit what the Chiefs like to do. Like guys like Josh Pascal, I think his play style is very much on par with what the Chiefs like, but he doesn't fit a lot of the criteria. Arnold Ebiketie, he's really light. He was down into the 240s at his pro day. I just don't know if I can see that one make a lot of sense for what the Chiefs asked their defensive ends to do. That's not even including what Steve Spagnuolo would say about it. Like, I just don't know if he's going to be able to pull it off. So like, you're working from such a limited pool of guys that can come up and start. And I think ultimately at the end of this, my takeaway is if you have a chance to trade up for one of those top 4, go do it, because they're close enough to a fit for what Steve Spagnuolo likes. He's okay with missing on one of those things, and all of them are relatively close to the threshold that they miss on. They're better players. They can come in and play on day 1 and have a high ceiling. Like, looking through, when you start looking at where things fall off and then what the Chiefs like out of their defensive end, it's hard for me to not see a reason to try to trade up.
Yeah. And okay, let's take a look at some of the guys that would be available maybe 62 and a little bit later, because 10 edges going before 62 is not unheard of, you guys. So even if you wait to try and catch one of those guys, it's still going to be rough. Like, you can miss out on everybody, and then, you know, maybe you end up trying to trade up for your last guy and you end up trading up for Breeland Speaks. Let's just throw a name out there. So let's talk about some of these other guys that actually do fit some of the criteria, Maddie. Guys like DeMarvin Leal, Alex Wright, Michael Clemens, Sam Williams. These are all guys that, especially you and I, we like Michael Clemens, like Sam Williams a little bit. Like, these are guys that I think would make a lot of sense, play with power, have tons of length, a little bit rigid, but, you know, guys that would fit in, that I think would be almost as much of a contributor as maybe some of these other guys. Obviously don't have the same high ceiling as that second group that you mentioned, but guys that could come in and be in a rotational role, a la Mike Dana, you know, for the past couple of years, guy that could play at that sort of level that is a little bit longer.
That's the hard part. When you work within Spag's thresholds, you start looking at the guys that are great fits. And like you said, guys like Alex Wright, Michael Clemens, Isaiah Thomas out of Oklahoma, Zachary Carter out of Florida. A lot of people are going to go watch those guys. They're going to come away and say, I don't know if that guy's ever going to be a great pass rusher in the NFL. And you know what? I agree, but it hasn't mattered. They're bigger, they're longer, they're stronger guys. They're not necessarily the bendiest, best pass rushers of the groups. Like, you are kind of capping the ceiling when you look at this style of player. But to Craig's point, a lot of those guys, they are physically ready to come into the NFL and play on day 1. They might mostly be run stuffers. They might be power rushers that do need 3 seconds, 3.5 seconds to get to the quarterback, and which you're going to have to rely on your coverage to give you those 3.5 seconds.
We'll get there.
But that's the kind of defensive end that the Chiefs have often, or Steve Spagnuolo has often gravitated towards. And now when you start looking at guys that miss just one of the criteria, you do open up for some more high ceiling. Guys like Jeffrey Gunter is super explosive. He falls into that category. Dominique Robinson out of Miami of Ohio, this wide receiver turned defensive end, he fits into that category. Tyreek Smith out of Ohio State. Like, you can get more upside as long as you're willing to fudge on one of the criteria a little bit later in the draft. But also, with all those names, did you see kind of how I prefaced each one? There's a lot of development that needs to be had with them. So the concept of, oh, you missed out on one of these top edges, just grab 1 or 2 later, I do think falls a little short. I mean, this is something we talk about year after year. How many defensive ends come into the NFL and dominate when they weren't taken in the first round?
It's rare. It's very, very rare. And most of those guys are force rushers, dudes that have density and explosion and bend, you know, and it's usually not year 1 that those dudes contribute. It's usually year 2, 3, 4, 5, which, you know, that's fine if you're drafted for that, but Chiefs need a guy. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned force players. We don't have to go too far into this, but seeming we're about to get into CBAT talk here in a second.
Mm-hmm.
This is a perfect time. It unfortunately didn't get to make the draft guide this year, but I did set out to start making some version of a athletic, formula metric to tell me, or to at least help figure out if we can use athletic testing to figure out how good a pass rusher may or may not be. Similar concept to a force player, those of you that are familiar with it. But essentially, I am looking at various athletic testing metrics from guys in the NFL, seeing what kind of aligns to make these guys stick, what might not. And so far, I have only just worked through since 2010 guys that have been good, guys that have had over 20 sacks during their rookie contract and had a double-digit sack year. So, I'm looking,
which is rare, by the
Yeah.
way. I just want to make it very clear: 20 sacks in your rookie contract is rare in the NFL. Yeah,
this is the best of the best guys. So give me 1 second here. I'll tell you exactly how many guys have done that. So since 2010, 34 players have had over 20 sacks. Oh, nope. Sorry. It's a few more than that. It is 36 players have had over 20 sacks and a 10 sack plus sack season. And this is out of goodness over 300 defensive ends drafted over that time, about 340 players drafted. So very rare, but I'm starting to see a little bit of a correlation for some of the stuff that, athletically that they have in common. There's actually a pretty clear overall score that I have come up with that fits the vast majority of these guys into this one specific category. So I'm excited for next year. Once I get further into this to I'll tell you guys a little bit more. But what I can say, there's definitely, the more athletic you are, the odds are you might have a chance to be good. If you're not athletic, if you are a poor athlete, you're probably not going to be one of these dominant edge rushers. That is very, very rare. Read that out of the 37 guys here, only 5 of them are poor or not really good athletes that have done this. So you have to be a good athlete to be good in the NFL as a pass rusher. But that's just a long tease. That's a year-long tease right there.
Well, there you go. You should reference it every single week. Just kind of slowly tease that out and just kind of draw it out as much as possible. Just like we're drawing out the Macadoodles arrival in Kansas City. Listen, I'm ready for it to be here. They're ready for it to be here. You're ready for it to be here. Summer of 2022, that is coming to Kansas City. And you're going to feel so good about its arrival. You're going to feel as good as when the Chiefs trade up to go get Kayvon Thibodeau, who is falling because NFL teams don't like his attitude. Who cares? The Chiefs are going to bring him in. He's going to be an elite player, just like Macadoodles is going to be an elite player in the liquor store game. They're going to take the best care of you. But there's only one Kayvon Thibodeau, but there can be more Macadoodles. So if you're a franchisee, get a hold of Roger, info@macadoodles.com, and let's start sprinkling these all around Kansas City. Get some elite liquor stores with elite customer service and elite selection to the area. All right, Maddie, do you have anything more that you would like to add to the defensive end talk, or are you ready to nerd out about the position that the Chiefs do not draft in cornerbacks?
I just wanted to make sure that we flushed out this cliff talk here, because I think this is important as you get into the draft season. So it doesn't have to be long, but we kind of talked about it. Your first 4, you're looking at being gone by pick 15. We're going to say being conservative. That next group of 6-ish guys, I think you would have to take by pick 50 if you're the Chiefs to feel comfortable. I don't know if you can sit around and wait until pick 62. Like, what is your plan going this? How are you trying to attack it if we're basing it generally off those numbers? Where are you trying to get defensive ends from this draft class?
I'm hoping that David Ojabo is there at 29, and I'm just relying on Melvin Ingram and the bodies in the room to get it done this year, if I'm being honest. Maybe you take Michael Clemens in day 3 if he's still around, and you roll with some solid guys, not necessarily the highest upside defensive end room, but you've got a blue chipper coming there. After that, I don't really like a lot of the other guys. I mean, like anybody else that you're drafting in that second group is going to be under more or less the same sort of position as David Ojabo. Not a whole lot of expectation. Obviously, they can be on the field. David Ojabo won't, but they could be on the field, not in any real tangible way that's going to make a drastic impact on this team. So that would be my strategy, and I completely understand why the Chiefs would not even touch that with a stick. What's yours here?
This is the hard part. I think the Chiefs are almost in the worst spot for this because you're most likely not going to get one of the top 4. I'm trading up. If there's anybody available after pick 10, at pick 10, I'm trying to go get the last of the top tier guys. If the Chiefs don't want to give up that much draft capital, even if you just sit around and pick at 29, I'm not sure you're going to have your choice of those 6 names. You might be getting the 3rd or 4th guy of that group. I mean, 6, 7 defensive ends going before pick 29 in this draft class is entirely plausible. So, like, if all of a sudden you lose out on a Karlaftis and a Jabo and a Mafe, those 3 others go off the board, you're choosing between Evan Ketty, who doesn't fit, Josh Pascal doesn't fit. Are you going to be the team that takes Drake Jackson in the first round? I understand. The athletic profile is there, but that college film, the college production is not that good for him coming out of the Pac-12, which is not that strong. Like, they're in a bad spot, but I also don't think you can wait either. Like, that's the trick. Good edge class. Everyone's talking about how good the edge class is, and I agree. It's just not great when you need one guy to come in and start right away, a guy, same guy, different guy to build your defense around in the future. Like, you don't have a lot of those guys coming in at the end of round 1 in any draft. So, like, you almost just have to take 2 swings from that tier 2. If you can't trade up, would be, I guess, my preferred plan of attack there.
Would you take 2? Would you go 30 and 50 at edge right now? If you stayed put, you would. Okay.
If one was a Jabo, especially because the upside is very high, and he's not going to do a lot for you in year 1. So, like, you might need a little bit of cover. So, like, taking him, one of those picks would be good. I'm a huge fan of Sam Williams out of Ole Miss. I think he actually is a perfect Steve Spagnuolo fit, and he can actually bend, and he's kind of explosive. There's just some off-field stuff that they have to look into from, back in 2020 at Ole Miss. So there's a question mark there, but I'm taking 2 of those guys if I can't trade up, I think, and that depends on what the wide receiver room or the cornerback room does.
Yeah. So let's move on to cornerbacks here. Now, once again, like on the Substack, Maddie's today, I wrote an article about cornerbacks, and I kind of evaluated that this cornerback class has pretty short arms. Now, it's not the shortest since I've been doing, all of this tabulation of everything. It's not the shortest group that we have seen. It is the second shortest group that we've seen. And a lot of these guys that we've looked at have particularly short arms. Now, you think about cornerbacks, it's like that's important because, if you're on the boundary, you're having to try and go up and make a play at the catch point. The NFL is just reloading every single year with giant physical freaks that can jump out of the building at wide receiver right now. So every inch of advantage that you can get, you need at the cornerback position. Steve Spagnuolo, has kind of adopted this as well. The NFL average for cornerbacks at the combine since 2010 is 31.4 inches. Steve Spagnuolo's average for players that he has drafted and given significant playing time to is 31.85 inches. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're talking about a large group of players like that, because Spagnuolo's been getting cornerbacks into his room for a long time, that is a significant difference above average. That includes guys like Rashad Fenton and Mike Hughes that have shorter than the NFL average arms. Now, you think about Rashad Fenton, you think about Mike Hughes, you're not thinking, there's a blue chip corner or anything like that. So I took a little bit of a look at what the cornerback group this year looks at, because, the Chiefs need a cornerback. They don't draft cornerbacks, but they do need a cornerback. So we're going to do some of the similar things that we did with the defensive end room here, trying to look for big physical dudes with longer arms, because once again, Spagnuolo is going to want those guys. And for this reason, I can get it. Like, Betty, you get why cornerbacks need long arms and why they want to be physical and everything like that makes sense. We don't have to try and explain how that's different than the rest of the NFL, right?
No, I get that. I get why Steve Spagnuolo wants defensive ends with long arms too. Watch how they play. Those guys have to play a gap and a half. Like, they're not just setting the edge. They're doing a lot. So I get it on defensive line too. There's just, on the defensive end position, there's no way to make up for a lack of flexibility or explosiveness. Like, it just doesn't exist. You can't just be like, haha, my arms are really long, so I can touch you. and there's nothing you can do about it. Like that doesn't do you a lot for a defensive end. Whereas the corner, you got long arms. One, the ball has to be fit over your head, makes it a lot more difficult. Two, a receiver has to get away from you to be open. It makes a difference. It's just like a reactive versus like a proactive kind of position. So like I get the differences here and why the NFL is also aligned with Steve Spagnuolo, whereas edge rushers, a lot of other people are more willing to take the better athletes.
Right. And I think it's important to note here that in the first round of the NFL draft, what we're about to talk about right now, in the first round, there have only been 3 players in the last 7 years drafted in the first round playing cornerback with arms under 31 inches. Those 3 players are Mike Hughes, like we previously mentioned, Vernon Hargreaves, and Damon Arnett. None of those 3 players made it to year 4 of their rookie contract, despite being first round picks. They're going to add to that this year because this cornerback group is short. And one of the players that's going to add to that with is arguably the best cornerback in the draft class if he stays healthy here, in Derek Stingley Jr. He's got 30 and 30.625 inch arms. He's certainly going in the first round in the NFL draft. Matty, I don't even think that it's going to be a Damon Arnett, Mike Hughes scenario. I think this is going to be more of an outlier than anything. And then Sauce Gardner's the other guy, and Sauce Gardner is the polar opposite because Sauce Gardner has 33.5-inch arms. Neither one of those guys is leaving the top 10. Is that fairly safe to say right now?
I think Stingley could be on the fringe, but he's going in the first half of the first round, I think. I think there's enough questions with his Lisfranc injury. I mean, one, you don't want any player coming off that, but a corner,
sure.
It's a lot of planting and pressure going into that foot all the time off of 2 injury-riddled years. Like, if he falls a little bit, I'd get it. And the arm length thing for him, though, it definitely creeps up. But the thing you go back to with Stingley is go watch him play. Has it ever mattered? Like, I mean, has it? I've never seen an issue where I've once been like, oh man, his arms are kind of short. Like if anything, I think they were long. Now, maybe my idea is warped because I watched the practice reps of him versus Alligator Jamar Chase, and it's just 2 guys with short arms battling it out. But they're both, I mean, they dominated everybody else too.
But see, that's the thing. Yeah, if you talk about a guy like Jamar Chase, who is a good contested catch guy who can go up and get it with explosion and ability, Derek Stingley has that explosion. So you can make up for the short arms, but it's going to be a situation where Derek Stingley probably, likely, almost certainly is going to be gone before the Chiefs take a pick here. So let's move on to the next 2 guys here, Andrew Booth Jr. and Trent McDuffie. Andrew Booth Jr. also not really. Oh, you're going to correct me about the next 2 guys?
Oh, no. I was just saying, because who's coming up. I know what's happening.
Yeah. So Andrew Booth Jr. has 31.5-inch arms. He's not doing much testing. He's still coming off of some injuries. I believe he had core muscle surgery recently as well. Expected to be back before the start of training camp, but may cause him to fall because he didn't test. But let's talk about McDuffie here. Trent McDuffie, 29.75-inch arms. Trent McDuffie would be the first player since 2010 to be drafted in the first round with under 30-inch arms. It has not happened before at cornerback. I should be clear. I'm sure there's a running back or something that's had under 30-inch arms, but nobody has been drafted with that short of arms at that position. The earliest guy that was drafted before that was Dante Jackson, who ran like crazy. So what do you feel like about Trent McDuffie? Obviously a physical player. Like I think that there's dog in him. I think he's a good player and all of that. Steve Spagnuolo may look at those arms and just immediately say, hey, listen, I can't play that dude on the outside. So what do you think about Trent McDuffie?
Okay. So I guess this is slight peeking behind the curtain, but if I remember correctly, there was some mild interest, if not more, in the Chiefs with Byron Murphy coming out of that same program, who went pick 33 overall, so the first pick in the second round. Byron Murphy did have over 30-inch arms, but not by 30 and 1/8 inches. Like, we're dealing with a very small difference here. But like, the Chiefs were interested mildly at the very least in another corner that had shorter than preferred arms that was very good. You want me to compare and contrast those two players, which is very easy because they're coming from the same school. Trent McDuffie's better. And I love Byron Murphy. Trent McDuffie's just a better player. You go back and listen to these names that Craig was listing off earlier with Vernon Hargreaves, Damon Arnett. Who's the third guy I'm going to blank on now? In the first round with the short arms, Craig.
Mike Hughes.
Mike Hughes. Okay, well, those three guys, I think you can go ahead and put up a lot of off-field concerns between those three guys combined. Guess who has zero off-field concerns? Trent McDuffie. He's arguably like one of the most impressive interviewers that anybody has had during, or interviewees anyone's had during this process. So if he also breaks this trend, if he's the first to do this, it wouldn't floor me, because again, I'm comparing him to his ex-Washington alum and Byron Murphy, who has just tiny bit longer arms, went pick 33. There's at least some other players who weren't as good of prospects as him that have gone in the first round with short arms, not as short, but short arms. I could make the case that it makes sense for him to do that this year. That said, will it be the Chiefs?
No. Yeah, I don't think so. And so, like, now you've got 4 cornerbacks. Andrew Booth Jr., probably a guy the Chiefs would be interested in if his medicals check out. And once again, I know we just got done talking about David Ojabo a lot and maybe redshirt in a year. The Chiefs have been very reluctant to spend high assets on guys with medical issues. They just have, period. You know, I know everybody's going to point to Trey Smith. That was in the 6th round. The risk was minimal at that point. They felt like they had that figured out. So a guy that's coming off of a whole bunch of injuries, didn't get to test, you know, the Chiefs may be out on Andrew Booth Jr. Trent McDuffie may be one of the only guys. And I don't see this team trading up, because that's, I think, what it would take, because Trent McDuffie, I think, is going to go even higher than the Chiefs pick. I don't see them trading up for a guy with under 30-inch arms to play him on the boundary, which is kind of where the Chiefs are going to need a guy this year. So I think that that's going to be an iffy proposition for them. And that, go ahead, Maddie. Yeah,
I'm with you. I wanted to throw one more guy into this mix because I think it's a good spot to talk about cliffs after this. So I want to put Kaiir Elam in this discussion because this is where he's going to go. And I believe his arm length is over, or what is his arm length? You got to break it down.
30.875 would be then the 5th guy in the past 7 years to get drafted in the first round, actually 6th after McDuffie goes, under 31 inches. So once again, low on the arm length threshold. A guy, Kaiir Elam, is a popular pick for the Chiefs at, pick 29, pick 30. He's a guy that's going to fall well short. He's got the same arm length as Rashad Fenton, a guy that, the Chiefs have been very comfortable playing at Steve Spagnuolo's, reign here. But Rashad Fenton was a 5th round pick. Now, Elam's obviously got more going for him from an athletic standpoint and from a tape standpoint. But once again, as we talked about, you got these guys, and they fall outside of some of the physical specifications that you want. It makes it harder to pull the trigger on them. Kaiir Elam is one of those guys. Okay, Maddie, go ahead with your assessment of Elam here.
Oh, no. I think that's right. He's another guy that I would have not anticipated having short arms. I don't think it shows up for him on film either. Trent McDuffie, it shows up a little bit. I love the Andrew Booth. If you came up to me and said, hey, he has short arms, I'd be like, are you sure? But if you came up to me and said he had really long arms, I'd be like, I don't think so either. Like, I thought he'd be right in the middle. So, like, that's where I thought all these guys are. I'm surprised by Elam's. I think it's a good time to talk about the cliffs, because I think Stingley and Sauce Gardner belong on their own little bit, and the Chiefs, no real chance to get to them without trading up. I don't think there's any chance they get to Gardner either way. They shouldn't go trade up for either one. Then these next 3 that we just talked about, Elam, Booth, and McDuffie, I think are the next 3. I mean, unless you have somebody else you think should be added to that group, I think that's the end of guys that should get round 1 consideration at all out of the cornerback room.
I mean, here's the thing. We've seen guys like Kyler Gordon get thrown around a little bit. I don't think that Kyler Gordon is a round 1 player, but he at least has 31-inch arms. And then we've seen Roger McCreary get thrown around a little bit. And Roger McCreary, has under 29-inch arms. Just, catastrophically low. There's only been one player in the last 13 drafts that has been drafted with under 29-inch arms. McCreary will be the second, But once again, the NFL just does not gamble on guys like that. So I don't foresee either one of those guys. Now, all of a sudden, you are talking about a very serious cliff because everybody after this is going to be largely projection based or bad/short athletes. Am I right in saying that, Maddie?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You work out Trent McDuffie there, you work out Roger McCreary, and then like the next, if I'm looking through the KCS and draft guide right now, you're going to come to a fun name in Jalen Armour Davis. I don't think he's going to get anywhere near the first round, but you're looking at the, pick 50, 62, somewhere in round 3. I believe his arm length is also in the 30
under
point.
31-inch arms. Yeah. Yes.
Again, another guy that I wouldn't have guessed watching him press guys, but hey, it's there. But now all of a sudden, now we're talking about round 2 or round 3. So this stuff becomes a little bit more palatable. But like I'm even looking through here. Now, here's where the guys I think start to fit. I'm rounding out this next tier, this like tier 2, 3. So we said Jalen Armour Davis, Kyler Gordon, Tariq Woolen, Martin Emerson. I think that kind of rounds out that group of corners for me. I don't know if you have somebody else you want to put in there.
No, I think that's the two guys that I would have slotted in here. Martin Emerson, 33.5-inch arms, pretty good athletic profile. Not not exceptional, but pretty good athletic profile. Big dude. He's got a little bit of fluidity in his hips. Ran a good 3-cone. And then Tariq Woolen, just blazing fast. Huge dude, 33.625 arms. Like that's a projection-based guy, but somebody that you draft and you go, oh, we'll figure it out later because those tools surely won't fail us on the field. And I mean, a CBAT tier 1 guy, a guy that is, in the upper echelon, and guys like that work out over 3/4 of the time. So you just take that guy and hope that he's going to work out. But yeah, that's basically the end of that tier there. I think that you're right there. And so that may be a pick 50. Even would you take a Tariq Woolen at pick 50?
So
would you take a Martin Emerson at pick 50?
All right, so we took 5 guys off. Now we're adding another 4 corners, and to me, these 4 corners, I'm going to leave McCreary out for now. So Armour Davis,
I
Gordon,
think the NFL
Woolen,
will too. Yeah,
Emerson. That's your next year. I don't even know if Emerson goes this high, but I wanted to include him for the profile. I think these are kind of higher upside guys. These are guys that aren't necessarily ready on day 1, I don't think. But you get them into the room, you help define their technique, you get them out there on the field later in the season, you may have something. 50 though, 50 for a guy that I know I have to do a lot of work to at the cornerback position that's already so volatile. And like we said, Woolen of those 3, Emerson 2, and that's got some other limitations. I don't know if I feel great about reaching for guys that don't fit exactly what you want, that you also know you're going to have to develop. So then you start kicking it down to the next year. We talked about McCreary. I think I call this the slightly lower ceiling group. You got the McCrearys. I would probably put Emerson here just because I think he's very zone specific. I don't know if he can play man in the NFL. So you have Emerson, McCreary, Kobe Bryant, who will pour one out after that pro day. But that's about it, though. Like, this is why I want to do it. I just named 3 more guys. That's all I want to touch on day 2. Is there anybody? I got one more guy I know you want, but there's anybody else on day 2 that you like?
One more guy I want. No, I mean, and here's kind of what I put in the article. I think when people do these mock drafts, like we're going through all these guys, and not very many of these guys have length. They just don't have length, and we know the NFL, really wants cornerbacks with length. That means guys like Fayetteville State's Josh Williams, Missouri Western's Sam Webb, and Washington State's Jalen Watson. 3 guys that I think people just kind of generally look at and go, well, those are day 3 guys. We'll take them in day 3 in mock drafts. The NFL might be gambling on those guys in day 2 because
Damari
of
Mathis,
their length.
Cam Taylor-Britt, super freak athletes that also have length. Like, these are all guys that I do this too, but I know a lot of mock drafts that I see for the Chiefs. Oh, I don't get my cornerback in the first couple rounds. I'm just going to take 2 of these guys that we just mentioned in day 3 because I like them there. Like, if everybody likes them there, they're going to go earlier. And like Craig's saying, you don't have length. They're going to chase length. So
there is a very good chance that 2 of those 3 guys go off the board before Roger McCreary, who's got infinitely better tape than they do. Infinitely better tape than they do. The NFL just does not like short-armed guys. So, when we're talking about, I'll just pick up Josh Williams in round 4. It's like Josh Williams might go before the Ryan Poles comp pick. He really might, because an NFL team is going to look at the length and say, I can do something with that and try and go forward with that. So that brings up the other cliff here. I think if you want to feel comfortable getting a guy that can play on the boundary for Steve Spagnuolo, obviously there are guys that are going to be, fine to fringe and stuff like that. We talk about how Brett Veach waits. Oh, we'll just wait until round 4. He'll find another diamond in the rough. He'll find another guy that can play for Steve Spagnuolo, and maybe he can. But your player pool in this specific draft class is going to be so limited because the rest of the NFL, like Maddie said, it lines up with what the rest of the NFL likes. The rest of the NFL is going to be looking for that size as well. You're not just going to be able to sit and wait for the size to kind of fall to you, the athletes to fall to you because, maybe the tape's not as good and you can develop them. Those guys are probably going to go a little bit earlier, especially in this draft class that doesn't have some of the crazy high-end talent that are going to kind of force feed teams. There are a lot of cornerback hungry teams in the NFL right now, and there's not a lot of them in this NFL class that can come in and start right away. So I don't know, Maddie. I just see this thought that the Chiefs are just going to be drafting a cornerback in day 3, and I've joked about it as well. The more I start to think about the length element of this and the athletic element of this, I don't know that they can wait that long.
That's going to be the trick. I mean, we talked about all the top guys. We talked about the high ceiling guys. We mentioned a couple low, safe picks with the Emersons, McCreary's, Kobe Bryant. But then after that, now you're splitting the rest of everybody up kind of into boundary guys with length or slot corners. But when you start looking for boundary guys that you even just kind of like some of what they do, you're left with a Caleb Evans, Jalen Watson, Joshua Williams, Damari Mathis, Cam Taylor-Britt, Zion McCollum, who's a guy I know that you kind of like because of the athletic testing, and then Sam Webb. That's it. That's your entire kind of list of guys that showed any promise on film for the rest of the draft. You waiting to get one of those guys on day 3, like 31 other teams are probably waiting to get them on day 3. That's where it gets dicey. You're operating from such a small pool, and not a single one of these guys that I just named is probably ready to step in and start early on either. You're looking at a little bit of development. So this goes back to kind of like edge. If you're trying to figure out how you attack this position, how are you just going to invest early because of where these cliffs fall? That's not what the Chiefs do, but is that what you have to do in this draft?
I mean, I think you do. I really do think you do. And unfortunately, it may be a guy that isn't quite as pro ready because of the way that the class is built, like a Tariq Woolen, who, has super high ceiling, and I will be jacked for Tariq Woolen to be on this team, but not a guy that I'm looking at and going, okay, you're going to start across from L'Jarius Sneed. There's your boundary corners. Everything's great. Needs some work. So, okay, Maddie, I'm going to put it this way before we get out of here.
Uh-oh.
Do the Chiefs draft an edge in round 1, and do the Chiefs draft a cornerback in the first 2 days of the NFL draft?
Yes. I think based on everything that we talked about, I think they kind of have to. I don't know. They have enough picks this year. Now, this obviously changes. If the Chiefs have to trade up for an edge and they use other day 2 picks, I'm reserving the right to change the cornerback aspect of this. If they don't have, 4 picks on day 2 like they do currently right now, this might change. And I might not agree with this. But when I start looking at the cliffs of where the good players go off, then the okay players go off, then the guys that need a bunch of work, and then the guys that just fit, but they probably won't be anything in the NFL. I think to even get a guy that just fits what the team likes to do, even though it's a long shot, that just fits what the Chiefs like to do, I think they might have to take it in the top 103 picks of the NFL draft. I don't know if you can sit around and wait till day 3.
I'm going to say that the Chiefs are going to add a cornerback before the draft, and then the board's not going to follow them, and Brett Veach is going to do what he did during this offseason and say, hey, listen, we've tried to draft guys, but
that's another wild card.
Worked out. Yeah.
And we push this to the last 5 minutes, but if they're going to continue to stick to this, we're not going to overdraft important positions because the way the value is, if they're not going to emphasize the positional value part and just look at raw value, and I'm not saying that's what they do for sure, but Brett Veach kind of said that's what they do for sure. He said the value of corner doesn't align with where they pick often. I'm like, well, if that happens again, if they're going to stick true to that, they're never going to catch up. The cornerback talent is a cornerback in this draft class is never going to be the most talented player on the board, except for maybe round 1. maybe in round 1, Andrew Booth Jr., Trent McDuffie, or Kyer Elam are sitting there on the board, and I can hear the argument that they're the best player overall. But after you get past that first round, if he sticks true to his guns and what he has for the past 4 drafts, I don't know when they take a corner again, because it just will never align.
Yeah. And before the Chiefs draft Daxton Hill with the first round pick, and we can't be super mad about it because he's a really good player that's probably going to play in this slot. That'll do it for this edition of the KC Laboratory. If you liked what we were doing here, go down there, subscribe, hit the subscribe button. Stay tuned to what we have coming up. The draft is coming up at the end of this month. The KCSN draft guide is coming out this week. Go get that. Do everything that you can to stay tuned to what we're doing, because we're going to keep you up to date with some of the stuff like this, where we're going through positional breakdowns, what the Chiefs want, and kind of where guys could be. And we will be there live with you during draft weekend to break down the picks as they occur, to try and give you some instant analysis. I want to thank you all once again for joining us, and we'll catch you later.